Hi, everyone. My name is Roberta McIntyre. I'm President and CEO of Fire Safe Sonoma. Fire Safe Sonoma is the county-wide fire safe council for the county of Sonoma. Fire Safe Sonoma has been around for 26 years now, helping folks be more wildfire prepared. Our mission is basically to provide outreach and education with regard to wildland fire safety and risk reduction. That's what we do. And I've been with Fire Safe Sonoma since 2008, and I'm going to leave it at that and just kind of jump right into it. Let's see. So, let's see. With us today, helping out is Sarah Hasselberg. She's with Fire Safe Sonoma. And she'll be handling some of the stuff in the background, as well as Mason Innumerable. He's with Fire Safe Sonoma, helping with stuff in the background as well. I don't know if you all were able to attend last month's presentation, but last month we had Justin Wick. He's a CAL FIRE captain and pilot of Copter 104 for CAL FIRE, and that resource is typically housed up at Boggs Mountain on Cobb. Really good presentation. It's available on our YouTube channel. If you haven't seen it, go take a look. This month we've got a really cool speaker, and then which I'll get to in a moment. And then next month in our speaker series, we're going to have Susan Hayden. She's with Sonoma Water, used to be Sonoma County Water Agency, I think, but now they call themselves Sonoma Water. And she's going to be introducing a new tool called the Wildfire Resilience Planner. It's kind of like the fuel mapper in the Sonoma County CWPP hub site WRI, Wildfire Risk Index tool set, all rolled together and then put on steroids. The thing is amazing. It's in beta test right now. And if you join us next month in our speaker series, you'll get a sneak preview of what that tool is looking like and how it's going to work. And then, so check it out. And again, if you miss it, it'll be on our YouTube channel. So without further ado, I want to introduce today's guest. Today we have with us Jason Wells, and he's going to be talking to us about wildland fire behavior, as well as wildland fire fuels treatment methods. There's basically 4 methods that one would use to reduce wildfire risk, particularly on a large scale. And Mason's going to dive into that. He's a registered professional forester, and he works with both the Gold Ridge Resource Conservation District as well as the Sonoma Resource Conservation District. And his focus at the RCDs is to provide technical and planning assistance to landowners. He helps build forestry programs capable of addressing vegetation and fuels management concerns all throughout the county, as well as working to address post-fire recovery efforts. He's actually born and raised in Petaluma, so he's a native guy. He graduated from Humboldt State University with a Bachelor of Science degree in forestry with an emphasis in forest conservation. And the best part about Jason, as far as Fire Safe Sonoma is concerned, in our relationship with him, is he is a certified California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection. He's certified by them to conduct archaeological surveys for plans on which CAL FIRE is the lead agency. That's not what I meant to say there. The main reason we love Jason is he's a registered forester. But anyway, now that I messed that up, I'm going to hand it off to you, Jason. So I'm going to go ahead and pin you and let you take it from there.
All right. Well, thanks, Roberta. I appreciate that. As you mentioned, I'm an RPF, so I deal in forests. So let's see here. Start from the beginning. Everybody see that? Everything okay?
Yep.
Great. Okay. Well, so today I'm going to be speaking, I'll give a little introduction into wildland fire behavior. And as Roberta mentioned, I'll also talk a little bit about a few of the management strategies and the tools that a land manager may be able to use to help modify vegetation and fuels. So A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation was adapted from a textbook called Fire in California Ecosystems. It's a UC Press publication. I highly recommend if any of this kind of stuff is interesting to you and you're the kind of weird like I am that buys textbooks, this is a great one. So look into that. That's my name, and let's get started here. So this is an overview of what we're going to be discussing in the presentation. In order to understand the tools available to modify fire behavior, we're going to need to know how fire works. So the fire triangle is the distillation of all of fire science, right? So the legs of this triangle will be continually referred to in the presentation. And in order for combustion to occur, you need heat, oxygen, and fuel. So I have that. You can see on the flame side, those are the three legs of the fire triangle, right? And there's a number of other triangles that are available for reference, and we'll be coming back to this triangle quite a bit. So in the presentation, we're going to discuss how the fire triangle and the wildland fire behavior triangle affects how fire moves through the landscape and how it affects conditions during and after the fire. So combustion is sort of the opposite of photosynthesis, right? So where photosynthesis brings water and CO2 and energy from the sun together to form a base material for wood production, combustion undoes that, right? So there are three different phases of combustion. There's the preheating phase, which is the first phase where energy begins to boil off excess water that's in the woody fuel, and organic compounds necessary for combustion become volatilized as gases. So those gases mix with oxygen, and you can kind of think of that like how in the initial stroke on a gas engine brings fuel and oxygen together, and then the ignition, the spark plug, right, provides an ignition. That's really what is kind of happening when you're heating up these fuels, right? So basically, once that air and fuel mix are in a ratio conductive to burning, you will then have the gaseous stage of combustion. And this is really just that portion where the gases have been volatilized and they are actively burning. So not much, I guess, past that to talk about. But that's sort of what you think of actually when you think about fire. So the picture that's in back right here, that is during the gaseous phase. It's the flashy looking part, right? And then there's the smoldering phase, which is after that gas has been combusted, but there's still residual heat. So it's the final phase that results in charcoal and unburnt material continuing to burn after that flaming front has passed through. So temperatures and rate of spread are a lot lower during that phase than during the gaseous phase, but sustained heat from smoldering has significant adverse effects on plants and soil. So I'll talk a little bit about this later in the presentation about the difference between severity and intensity. But when we talk about severe effects, the smoldering phase and that long-term heating is a really big deal. So bringing it back to the fire triangle here, fuel is the only factor really that can be controlled prior to ignitions. So it's the only variable that's shared between the fire triangle, the wildfire triangle, and the fire regime triangle. And so there are many characteristics that fuels can have which greatly affect how quickly fire starts, how fast it spreads, how intensely it burns, and how long it will continue to burn. So when discussing fuels and their characteristics, you can always think back to personal experience, like building and maintaining a campfire. So, or like a wood stove fire or something like that, right? So, should be on to slide. There we go. Sorry about that. I have two different computers going on at the same exact time.
I know that feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So, all right, where am I? So, fuel size. So, fine fuels refer to fuels that are easily ignited. These fuels generally have a high surface area to mass ratio. So, it's tinder, not a log, right? They burn quickly and they're quickly consumed. Heavy fuels are difficult to ignite but they generate significant amounts of heat when they do ignite, and they burn for a long time. So like logs or fuel wood. Moderate fuels are those that are in between, right? So that could be a stick or a branches. It would be something that you might consider kindling. An intuitive measurement called fuel loading describes the amount of available fuel for combustion. The more fuel you have, generally, the bigger the fire can be. And another consideration will be how wet the fuels are, known as fuel moisture. You're going to know, like from trying to light a fire in the rain or whatever, or in the wintertime, that trying to burn wet fuels is really difficult. So it requires a significant amount of energy to start combustion. So move on to the next one. This slide describes the importance of fuel orientation. There's a balance between allowing oxygen to penetrate the fuel bed and to feed combustion while maintaining enough fuel to maintain combustion. So again, looking here at the fire triangle, you can see that we have oxygen as being an important component. So making sure that there's actually enough fuel or oxygen to sustain fire. So campfires are commonly built in either a log cabin or a TP method, and that's because that maximizes airflow while maintaining fuel connectivity. Grass is one of the most volatile fuel types because it's oriented vertically and it has a high surface to area to mass ratio. So there's plenty of available oxygen, and individual fuels are easily preheated and ignited. So this slide just describes in more detail the concept of fuel loading, right? The more fuel that's available, the greater the potential energy that's stored in that fuel. Not all potential fuels are going to be burned in a fire because of fuel connectivity and relative moisture and certain environmental impacts like microsite and different conditions that are going to be happening in there. But in general, more fuel means more potential for fire. Did I just skip 2? I did. This slide discusses fuel moisture. So it's discussed as a percentage of water weight contained within a fuel. Oftentimes, firefighters and land managers talk about fuels in terms of their time lag classes. And in fact, I actually was referring to them earlier. There were pictures here. I'll go back. So there's 1 hour fuels, 10-hour fuels, 100-hour fuels. You can see, what those images look like here. So basically, your 1 hour, like what the time lag classification means is it's the amount of time that it takes for a fuel to gain or lose moisture to the environment. So really, it's the difference between the relative humidity, so the moisture that's in the air, versus the fuel moisture that's in there. And through diffusion, you're going to have water moving either from the environment to the fuel or from the fuel to the environment. So 1 hour fuel changes. It's about 60% of that relative difference is really what the 1 hour means. But in general, 1 hour fuels will change on an hourly time period. 10-hour fuels change daily. 100-hour fuels change weekly. So what this really means for managing or for thinking about fuels when you're looking at the landscape is that the morning fog can saturate a 1 hour fuel, right? So like grass is early in the day, when the fog's in there, it might not be able to burn in the morning. But as soon as the sun comes out, those fuels are ready to burn, by noon. Alternatively, it could take a series of rain events to fully saturate a 100-hour fuel, but it's going to take equally as long for those fuels to lose that moisture over the season. So under a forested canopy, large fuels may not be receptive to fire until mid to late summer. And so fire behavior is the actual result of all of these pieces working together that we've discussed thus far. And now that we know how combustion occurs and how it's sustained, we can start to look at the landscape and think about how different fuel beds might react differently under given fire weather conditions. So there are 3 basic flavors of wildland fire. Surface fires, they burn litter, woody fuels, and low vegetation. Crown fires burn in the canopies of vegetation. And ground fires burn organic matter like roots and burn slowly. These fires generally have the most severe effects on the environment. So fire spread is determined by how quickly the heat source, or the burning part of the fire, right, can transfer that heat to unburned fuels, which act as a heat or energy sink. Hence that water component being really important because it requires more heat in order to preheat the fuel to ignitions, right? So heat energy is spread in one of three ways. There's thermal radiation, which is electromagnetic radiation, meaning it's the result of sped up electrons flinging out from a heated object. Thermal convection is the transfer of heat through a fluid or a gas. In this case, we're talking about really the air, right? Would be your gas. And thermal conduction is the transfer of heat directly from one object to the next. Wildland fire, thermal convection through the air is going to be the primary process and mean of heat transfer. Conduction is going to be like, oftentimes in ground fires, I would say. So that's like roots. So what this means for the fires that we're having around here and how fires are impacted is that basically wind and topography are the primary factors that are going to influence heat transfer. So as you can see on this image down here, I'm using the wrong mouse. You can see on an upslope fire, right, that it's the the heat transfer is both convection and radiation moving upslope, right? Whereas with a no wind fire, all that convection is going straight up. And a wind driven fire is sort of the in between. It can be flat, but it's pushing that heat to preheat the next fuel ahead, right? So as we already discussed, and I said this a bit, is that the moisture in fuels has to be driven off before combustion. So it's really, fuel moisture is the greatest heat sink that's going to happen in a wildland fire. And so unless that heat source can overcome the heat sink through sustained or particularly energetic heat transfer, something really explosive, wet fuels generally won't burn. And because of these factors, the major driving forces behind wildland fire behavior are topography, weather, and fuels, which is known as the fire behavior triangle. So that's why I have them highlighted here. So next piece here is that crown fires occur when the fire moves from surface fuels into canopy fuels. And so typically in order for a crown fire to occur and sustain, surface fuels need to preheat canopy fuels via thermal convection, right? This is generally caused by areas of built up fuels, which are able to bring the flaming front, so that actual burning gaseous part, into the canopy of trees. Though that's known as ladder fuels, right? So a passive crown fire is one where a small group of trees torch, but otherwise the canopy fire doesn't spread. And passive fire can happen in pretty much any wildland fire scenario. This could be a prescribed fire, it could be great conditions. You might still get a tree torches. It's not that big of a deal until it becomes an active crown fire, which occurs when wind speeds and connected canopy fuels support torching, which spreads from crown to crown. Independent crown fires are super rare. Well, I can't say super rare. I'm sure on a wildland fire, you're going to see this. But they occur basically when wind and fuel conditions allow the crown to crown spread that's independent of surface fuel fires. Meaning, generally, when you're having these active fires, it's the understory vegetation with the convective heat that is preheating fuels in between the canopy crowns. So you're actually enabling that fire to move through. On these independent crown fires, it's just generally wind conditions are such that it's pushing heat so quickly through the connected crowns that it's actually able to burn without anything really supporting that heat from below. And that is definitely not common. So the big thing about crown fires is they can't be fought by typical wildland firefighting methods, which are often primarily taking place with just like hand tools. The fire needs to be brought to the ground before it can be put out. So that's really, when you have a crown fire, that's when you're going to start really seeing people just like chopping down trees out in front of the burning front to basically disconnect that canopy fuel layer. So we'll talk about active management soon, but one of the big reasons about trying to get out ahead of these fires is because under these emergency conditions, firefighters are just going to do what they need to do to put the fire out. And if we can actually get out there ahead of the fire and modify the conditions, we're going to have better results without like emergency type, methods being used here. So I wanted to talk also about spotting. So in any case where there's crown torching, there's likely to be a firebrands or large burning fuels, which are cast out ahead of the active flame. So in wind-driven fires, it might not be necessary for crown torching to occur before you start getting firebrands that move out in front of the active flame. So in order for a firebrand to start a spot fire, it needs to land in a receptive fuel bed. And so here is a good indication of that. So what fuel bed types would be most likely to ignite rapidly, and what types would contribute most to spotting, right? So those are two different kinds of things. If we go back to thinking about how fuels are, right? Like it's the fine fuels that are more readily going to ignite. So it's the fine fuels that provide a good fuel bed, a receptive fuel bed to start a fire that is out in front of an active flaming front. But it's the heavy fuels that are going to really aid in that torching and that convective uplift and be able to throw firebrands, which think of a firebrand like a burning pine cone or something, right? Like pine cone might be somewhat heavy, but some of these wildland fires are known to be so intense that they can throw branches, cones, burning, pieces of wood. They can be thrown well over a mile, up to 2 miles, I would think, out in front of the flaming front. So the big thing about spotting, and this is the major reason why these wind-driven fires are getting the best of firefighters, is because during these kinds of conditions, firefighters aren't really fighting one fire. They're fighting multiple fires that merge together. And so often when you're standing there and you're trying to do backburns and you're trying to fight a fire that's on the next ridge over, and you start looking around, you've got 100 fires that are starting, small independent fires, it's going to be a situation where you end up having to evacuate and then begin the fight somewhere else. So, and this is something that I've heard quite a bit from firefighters who were on the Tubbs fire, the Kincaid fire, a lot of these wind-driven fires, is that the windy portion that really complicates things for the firefighters is only a small portion of the time that they're fighting the fire, right? But what ends up happening is you get these pushes, and then you've ended up starting all kinds of fires in different spots, and they have to go and regroup. And basically, when they're doing these firefighting, they're boxing off areas in terms of what areas are going to burn versus what areas are not going to burn. And when you have spotting, that box gets a lot bigger. So that's one of the big things about why we're doing so much fuels management is in my opinion, the biggest thing to do is to be focusing on figuring out how do we reduce spotting conditions and how do we manage available fuel beds for when we do have spotting, so that we have less fires that are starting around the undesirable fires, right? Because eventually, and I'll talk about this later, we want to be bringing back prescribed fire. We want to be bringing back intentional fire. And I guess the only other thing that I'll throw in there is I forgot to mention things like fine fuels. So like grasses, they'll send out a bunch of embers, right? But like fine fuels don't really sustain that heat for a long time like heavy fuels do. So if you burned a grass field, you'll still see embers go up, but you'll watch them burn out. And it's not the same situation as when you're burning in like heavy timber and you're actually having small fires dropping down. And it's interesting to see in person. you start getting a bunch of these little mini fires. And some of them go out on their own, right? And some of them actually hit a receptive fuel bed and will start a fire. So getting out ahead of that and limiting the number of receptive fuel beds, I think, is the name of the game. So fire effects. I said I was going to talk about this, and here we are, right? So fire severity is the magnitude of the effect that a fire has on the environment. Fire intensity is a measure of how explosive that fire is, or how much heat is generated at a given moment. So oftentimes the most damaging aspect of trees and soil is long-term heating. So live cambium exposure to temperatures in excess of 120 degrees Fahrenheit can kill a tree within an hour. 130 degrees, it could be minutes, and 147 degrees is considered an instantaneously lethal heat source for live tree tissue, right? You can have a high intensity and low severity fire. So if you think about a fast moving grass fire, that will be one that is putting out a lot of BTU really quickly, but you can walk right over it, right? So in terms of the residual heat, not a big deal. And oftentimes in these grass fires, and this is how a lot of these ecosystems evolved, right? Like there's a grass seed bed that isn't even consumed during the fire. So I had this happen during Kincaid fire and a couple other fires where we had really concerned people. Their whole property basically had burned, but it was all grass. And I walked out there with them and we started looking at the grass, and there's a ready to go seed bed that's just sitting in there. So that would be considered low severity. As soon as we had the first rain, their hillside was green, right? You can also have a low intensity, high severity fire though. And so that would be something like fire smoldering through mulch or through subsurface, like roots of dead stumps. So sometimes people put their pile burns, they'll put them on top of stumps, and then that'll actually burn the stump through. And then you basically have like a cigarette active effect burning under the ground. And so that's a long-term residual heat. And as I mentioned before, like 120 degrees for an hour is what will kill a tree. So that having that long-term heat is not good for the trees. It's definitely not good for soil. You can get hydrophobic conditions in certain soil types. And that's really where there's sort of it's actually like a lipid layer that creates over the top of sandy soils and makes it so that water is impenetrable. It doesn't actually, it slides off the top, it doesn't go in. That would be a high severity effect, right? So you've modified the way that water can actually penetrate into the soil. That's a problem. Fuels management. Okay, so this is the practice of modifying fuels so we can affect fire behavior. So we get the kind of fire that we actually want to have, right? To meet whatever objective it is that we're trying to do. So it's important to remember that things continue to grow after any initial treatment. So maintenance is essential. And there's only a limited number of tools that managers have in their tool belt. Some of them are more costly than others. Some are better suited for maintenance rather than initial treatments. And some have certain conditions that need to be met to actually make them feasible. So we'll talk a little bit more about that over time. But yeah, the big thing to remember is that anytime you make an action and you create growing space, something's going to grow there. I find that to be a foundational principle of silviculture, which is the art of growing trees. So mechanical treatments. Okay, so this is probably the primary treatment that you're going to see people doing. Any mechanical treatments are really anything that involves physical cutting, mulching, or processing of fuels. They can be completed by heavy equipment or crews with hand tools. Hand crews are the go-to treatment for most fuel management, but it's expensive because people are always going to be the most expensive part of any of your jobs, right? So mechanical treatments are preferred because they're simple to permit and they're straightforward. They're often the go-to treatment for initial vegetation management, occurring after a long history without disturbance like fire or grazing. So when there's so much fuel that's gone in there, what's nice is that you're able to individually treat fuels with mechanical treatments, and you can be very specific about the types of fuel and vegetation that will be treated. So treatments can occur throughout the majority of the year with little issue for liability relating to property damages and unintended effects on the environment. But crews are expensive and they're in high demand, so it might not be feasible to utilize this method for every acre across the landscape or to maintain work that was previously done. So some other tools that might be better suited for that: prescribed fire is the controlled use of fire to consume fuels in ideal conditions. The use of fire is especially effective because it actually consumes that fuel. It doesn't just modify how it is on the landscape, right? And so it actually reduces fuel loading where mechanical methods generally don't, unless you off-haul the material. There are two types of prescribed fire. There's broadcast fire and there's pile burning. Pile burning is easier to permit, but it's time consuming. Again, it's really, I would consider sort of in the same boat as that hand crew treatment. And generally it's how that works. You're using hand crews or you're using equipment to pile material and then you're sitting around and burning it. But I threw it in with the prescribed fire because it actually consumes the fuel. So in terms of hand crew treatments, pile burning is kind of one of the best options that we have. Anyway, broadcast burning is relatively inexpensive over large acreages, but with heavy fuel operations, it will likely be slow going, and so your expenses increase. So again, people, right? And the slower that you're going and burning through these fuels, the more time you're spending on salaries and people. But on a big grassland fire, you can burn off hundreds of acres of grass and you can get that done in an afternoon. It's pretty amazing. So if that's how you're looking at it, you can get a lot done in a short period of time. It's going to go a lot slower when you're in the middle of like heavy fuels. So anyway, there's liability concerns with broadcast burning surrounding potential for property damage and wildfire suppression costs. California is working on methods to address this with the California Burn Boss program. Often, but not always, mechanical pre-treatments are required to actually get the kind of fire effects that you want. So this might mean that a shaded fuel break needs to be created first, and that might be done using mechanical methods. Or it might mean that pile burns need to be conducted prior to a broadcast burn to remove some of the existing fuel loads so that you can achieve the desired effect with minimal mortality to residual trees, right? But prescribed fire, honestly, I mean, I think it's the most important maintenance tool. So once we've done these treatments and we've opened up the canopy and we've opened up the growing ground, something's going to grow there. And I think that once you've gone through and you've cleaned out some of those heavy fuels, the idea of being able to come back with a prescribed fire crew and treat large acreages and start to reproduce some of the those fire effects that might have influenced these forests, hundreds of years ago under native stewardship, right? Like, I think it's just a really important tool to be able to try to reintroduce to society today. So prescribed herbivory is the controlled use of animals to consume light fuels. There's a lot of considerations that you need to have when you're bringing live animals onto a property. Chiefly, that's food, shelter, water, and fencing. Prescribed herbivory is rarely a good initial entry tool in woody fuels because a lot of times the woody fuels are going to be taller than what the animals can actually eat, or it's going to be unpalatable. But it can really be used well for maintenance, annually treating grasses, and some animals like goats are pretty good, pretty effective actually at treating woody fuels. So, but again, they need to generally be low. So might be an option if you were trying to do something with a resprouting hardwood, something like California bay laurel, where you'd be able to actually do an annual treatment and reduce the resprouting. So, but yeah, there's a lot of things that you would need to consider. And if you were trying to consider bringing on animals, it would probably be a good idea to check in with a certified rangeland manager, and just make sure that you are putting the appropriate amount of animals on your property for what the goals are that you're trying to achieve. That was wrong computer. Prescribed herbicide is the controlled use of chemicals to inhibit plant growth or to cause cell death in targeted plants. A lot of people are concerned about the use of herbicide, and that's super valid, but it will likely be a necessary tool to increase the efficacy of landscape treatments and reduce costs, especially with resprouting species like California bay laurel or with invasive species like brooms. Sometimes the thing is, like, you would need to retreat an area many, many, many times to get the desired effect, or you could treat it with herbicide. So I think that there's a lot to that conversation, and I'm not personally an expert on chemicals. So I would say that before you ever plan to use herbicide as part of your integrated pest management plan, you really need to reach out to a licensed agricultural pest control advisor, because they are familiar with the strengths and weaknesses of each of these individual chemicals. And they're going to be able to give you a better idea about residence times, about drift, about how, where to use this product versus where to not use this product, a riparian area or, some other sensitive habitat community. So it's something I think that people are going to need to think about. And a lot of people start off being just wholeheartedly against it. But when you start looking at the reality of managing large landscapes, I think that targeted use of herbicide is something we need to consider. So that's all I got on that. Fuel management planning. So this is really like, planning part is the majority of my job personally. So it's an important exercise because the goals and objectives for management are going to change the prescription that you're trying to do. So for instance, a landowner might want to prioritize wildlife habitat, but they're also concerned about fuel connectivity. So they might need to develop a management strategy that prioritizes where dense cover can occur and where more open understories would be desirable from a fuels perspective. Anytime you're doing fuel management planning, your goals are going to be the first thing that you're identifying, right? So you work backwards from there. And when those goals are in conflict with one another, you look back at the landscape and you try and figure out where is it that there's the highest and best use for each of these areas to meet what it is that your goals are. So I guess an example of that might be like if you were putting in a shaded fuel break, right? And so in order to install that, you're taking out all the small trees and you're maintaining that condition. How is that area in particular going to regenerate canopy trees eventually when the current trees eventually die? And granted, you could just think, well, that's something to think about 60 years down the line, but realistically, you need to be thinking to yourself, how do I get a 60-year-old tree to replace this current 60-year-old tree, right? So like some of those things are an important part of the fuel management planning process. Another big thing too is just permitting and the environmental impacts that would happen from management. So beneficial uses of forests that could be damaged, including water quality or air quality, soil quality, wildlife habitat, aesthetics. All those are important things to be thinking about. So that's really where the planning side comes in, and looking at the landscape and looking at your budget and looking at where is it that the highest priority treatments are going to be happening, so that we can maybe, spend money on the hand crew on top of the ridge where there's easy access and we can get better rates or whatever. And then that's going to maybe enable us to use prescribed fire on larger windows throughout the year because we've created a safe box, right, to be able to get fire crews in there. And we're not going to lose this fire. So we're going to limit that liability concern, but we're going to use fire as a way to actually consume fuels on maybe some really steep stuff where I wouldn't really want to put hand crews because it's just super limiting and very cost expensive. So those are things to think about as well. And I did reuse this particular thing from a presentation that I was giving in the Mark West watershed that had been affected by the glass fire. And so I just wanted to say that for that particular area where you have large areas of high severity fire, and I mean, there's still a lot of pockets through there that look pretty good, but certain areas got hit pretty hard. I think that determining the goals and objectives for how they were going to manage that was going to be pretty critical. And one of the things that you would be really concerned about following a major catastrophic fire like that are invasives. And so having a new forest, you know, being established, or possibly a brush field could depend on the actions that we take today. So tree planting, managing the snags that are in there so that we can retain some soil moisture and actually have something come back. And then also just recognizing, I think the other thing that was important is that like managing all the fuels at once are going to be infeasible. And everything is going to require a really long-term commitment and a long-term vision. And so again, bringing it back to the management planning aspect, it's all about budgeting. It's all about thinking about what your goals are and what is it you're trying to achieve, and modifying the ecology of the area, whatever it is that your needs are. So that's pretty much my presentation. And it looks like we've got a solid 15 minutes for questions at this point. So
Yeah, great. If you can go ahead and stop screen share, Jason, and then we'll open up for some questions. It looks like we have one in the chat. So I'm going to keep that kind of on the holding pattern for now. And I have a couple questions of my own. Right off the bat, you mentioned with herbicides, you know, I suspect based on the way you talked about that, there are some folks out there that are fearful and concerned about using herbicides, and I am as well. But I agree with you, there are some good uses for herbicide. However, I do have a curiosity about herbicides. Do you know if herbicides can be made to target specific species? Like, for example, can you get a herbicide that'll work specifically on Scotch broom or something like that? Do we have, you know, I guess you'd call it herbicide engineering?
it doesn't work
okay?
like that, but
Okay.
there are herbicides that are more effective against certain species than other species. And so being aware of the suite of different chemicals that are available is how you can have, I mean, if you go into the local hardware store, you'll see certain herbicides say this targets this kind of plant and not this kind of plant. You can have, you know, herbicides that take out dandelions and don't take out your grass, right? But like, again, I am not a chemical expert, and that's the reason why there's actually a whole certification and licensing behind making those decisions, is because like it's not easy. But yes, there are absolutely chemicals where they target certain things over other things. And the other thing I want to mention about that is I think a lot of times people don't really understand about the amount of chemical that we're talking about when we're talking about using this in a forested environment. It's way less than what would be used in industrial food systems, right? So like you might use a cup of herbicide an acre. Like that's the difference that we're talking about. This is not like fly over broadcast spray, very targeted type work.
And I think if it's sold in California, I think there's additional probably regulations such that, you know, it has to biodegrade over a certain period of time or anything. Do you know anything about
You know, I'll just say, if you're planning on using it in the wildland and you're planning on doing that, it would not hurt to consult with a qualified PCA. I'm not going to say whether or not an over-the-counter, you know, herbicide is the appropriate remedy. I think that the smart thing to do would be to get somebody who is familiar with the tool that you're using and can use that tool effectively, rather than, you know, just trying to figure out whether or not
well,
triclopyr or mazapyr or whatever that you're finding on the store shelf is appropriate. So.
yeah. Well, clearly I'm not that person. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to Juliet when she has a question, and then we'll take your question, Charles.
Hi, great presentation. I attend a lot of these. Yours was really interesting and I appreciate it. My question is, how do private landowners like me who have rural ranch property with forested areas, in our case, it's a mixture of oak woodland and also conifers, primarily an old stand of ponderosa pines that were heavily hit by the Nuns fire. How can we retain the services of somebody like you? So a forester to help us create a management plan that involves the forested areas, not just the oak woodlands, but these conifers are a real challenge for us.
Yeah.
How do we get you to our property?
Well, I realized that the last slide that I didn't have my contact information on there, which is like, whoops. But you can email me. My email is jwells@sonomarcd.org. I'm sure that we can get that contact information out to people, but also, so that's if you want to work with the RCD, and the RCD has grants available right now to be doing technical assistance work for individual landowners. But let's say that we're backlogged and you want to get started now, right? Like we're also working on another program with our nonprofit partner after the fire. They might be back to Rebuild North Bay at this point, but we're running this program called the North Bay Forest Improvement Program, and it is an incentives program, meaning it does not cover the entire cost of treatments, but it incentivizes landowners to do the work by paying them back for doing beneficial forest work. And the first step in that whole process is to get a management plan. And you can get reimbursed for part of the cost of hiring a consulting forester. And there are a list on that website. I would just Google NBFIP, FIP, right? Which stands for North Bay Forest Improvement Program. There's no other NBFIP that comes up. It's going to take you to the right place if you Google it. And so you could start on a path in that way if for whatever reason you weren't working with yourself.
Really good answer for lots and lots and lots of people listening. And I am familiar with all those programs and pretty engaged. I guess it was just never, and we're not really looking for grants and reimbursement. We're just looking to hire a manager to help us with long-term planning. So it's as easy as just contacting the RCD and you and your teammates.
Yeah, if you want us to come out there and give you technical assistance and like that's totally available. If you just want me for a day to go out there and see what's up, we can do that.
Well, a day over a day repeatedly over a longer term. But yeah, that's really great to know. It's that easy. Sure. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and if anybody needed additional information, like stuff that I couldn't provide, I also keep a list of consulting RPFs, and so I wouldn't make a recommendation. I would just give you a list, and you could see who fits. Anyway, sorry, Charles, you had a question?
Well, yes, just a couple of comments. One, thank you for this presentation. It's really good. As you were going along, I was going to jump in and criticize at the end that you weren't really talking about anything except lowering fire danger with the programs you were talking about. But of course, that's the focus here. And then when you got to management, you began to talk about the other things that I'm concerned about besides the fire, which is, there's a whole field of fire ecology and how valuable fire is for the land. And then of course you got the critters and you got the water and everything else. So there's a lot more to it. And you obviously, when you begin to put a plan together, you're considering those things and get that kind of input. The other thing I wanted to mention was when you're talking about fuel beds, I've seen a number of studies that show fire moving across the landscape. And it turns out it looks as though the houses are the fuel beds. there are pictures you can see of places where the forest didn't burn around the community, but the houses did. Okay, do you want to comment about that?
Yeah, the house is going to be one of the most receptive fuel beds on the landscape, and that's why we recommend that people be doing home hardening and defensible space. I mean, if your goal is to prevent home ignition, that really is where you need to be spending your time. But if you're concerned about negative fire effects, such as what we saw in the Walbridge fire, the Glass fire, the Kincaid fire, where, I mean, like outside of where there are houses, we had really severe fire effects in certain pockets. And so that, I think, is the really, as a forester, where I focus my attention in. And you mentioned the field of fire ecology and how this affects the wildlife and how it affects water. My goodness, it affects water. And I think the key point is that fuels management, and the reason why we want to do this is so that we get the kind of fire that is beneficial for the environment. We want to be reintroducing fire, but you have to recognize that the landscape that we're dealing with today is very different from the landscape that was inherited 150 years ago at the start of industrialization, right? Like, we have clear cut a lot of forests. We're starting with second, third, growth forest conditions. We've introduced people, we've introduced roads, we've introduced invasives. So it's going to be an interesting thing to figure out how to reintroduce fire, because that is how the ecology in this area adapted. Sorry, I just looked over and saw the chat. But how to do that in like the 21st century, you know what I mean? So that's something I'm interested in for sure.
Okay, we'll get to the YouTube chat. Mason's handling that. He'll share that out with us in a minute. There's a question that's been in the chat for a while. I want to get to from Sebastian. Sebastian says, maybe you can take a look at it. You're probably more versed at this than I am. Well, not probably, you are more versed at this than I am. You could probably understand the question better than I can. But Sebastian,
the understory one?
Yeah, if you don't mind.
Yeah, understory fuel reduction efforts seem to be frequently boiled down to removing every young tree. How do you balance the latter reduction fuels goal with the desire to allow for recruitment of new trees? That's a great question, and I love it because that's been my main concern about a lot of the conversation as of right now. In my opinion, the way that you manage for that is you zoom out. And you look at the landscape and you think about, where is it that I'm putting in shaded fuel breaks? And those fuel breaks are not supposed to be covering the majority of your property. They're supposed to enable you to be able to get fire in other places. And so silviculture is the art of managing growing space between trees and making sure that there are areas for new growth to be able to replace existing growth, right? And a lot of the science of silviculture has been shaped around logging, but those tools and understanding how trees grow and respond to disturbance, that is valid coming at it from a forest conservation standpoint and trying to figure out how is this forest going to move over time or change over time. And so making sure that you have what I would call advanced regeneration. These are mid-sized trees to be able to take over or when other trees are gone is super important. And cleaning out understory brush and all the branches and all the things that come down and connect fuels and build up fuels to the point where it kills those trees. You can do that and you can still maintain a diverse ecology of different kinds of species. They just need to be discontinued. We just can't have just a a wall of vegetation, right? And like that is not how most of at least Sonoma County's forests would have ever looked like with continual fire regimes. I mean, that's sort of the cleansing process of having fire, but the primordial forest, right, which is probably a terrible term to use, I don't know, but like the forests that were inherited at European colonization, right, were very different from the forests that we're dealing with today, and they were adapted to frequent fire. So it trying to replicate those kinds of conditions are why we do management plans, and it's why we think about where it is that that's feasible, given access, given equipment, given personnel to be able to do a prescribed fire. And we are trying to do that as much as we can. I mean, I don't think we're going to treat every acre, right? But if we treated, 40%, 30% of the landscape, how much easier would it be when a wildfire, an undesirable fire came, for CAL FIRE to be able to box the area where the fire is right now, knowing that there's a large area that the fire is going to put itself out, right? If there's not a receptive fuel bed, it's not going to turn into a fire, regardless of wind conditions. It needs fuel. So as I mentioned before, I mean, wind conditions can make it much easier for fire to connect and to spread and to spot, but you still need fuel. So.
Okay, well, we just have a minute left, so we do have a couple questions through the live stream from Paul Woodward, and it sounds like maybe a couple have been handled through proxy, but there's a question, are fire safe councils coordinating private, federal, state, and CAL FIRE programs? At Fire Safe Sonoma, we are engaged with entities at all levels, well, mostly state and local, state, county, fire districts, local COPEs, local fire safe councils, Firewise communities. We try to stay engaged and involved with all those to make sure folks know what's going on. And we're kind of like the giant messenger or the hub of information. We try to share stuff out, whatever we know, we try to share. And we're also very inclusive. So we're not like some club you have to join, or we're not governed by specific laws that say, oh yeah, if you want to work with us, you have to be this or that or the other thing. And then he also has a question. CAL FIRE used to come by and make suggestions. I think CAL FIRE, if you contact them, they'll still send somebody out and give you some advice as a one-on-one kind of a thing. A local fire in many fire districts in the county also do that. If it were me, I'd probably call local fire first, have them send somebody out to do a walk around. When you call them, just make sure you let them know you want them to come out and give you advice. It's not meant to be a code enforcement visit. Just make that clear to them. And for you, Jason, is painting stumps with herbicide concentrate after cutting, is that a recommendation? Do you know anything about that?
It could be. It depends on the herbicide, and it depends on the thing that you're trying to treat. And I would not be the one making that recommendation. That would be a professional, an agricultural pest control advisor is who would make that recommendation, and then a qualified pesticide applicator would be the other licensed individual or professional organization that would then go in and actually do that.
Yeah.
So I can only really make general recommendations that, hey, you've got this super invasive species that's going to come back and is going to continually be problems. And here are your ways that you can treat it. You can either go out there and pull it every single year. And that sounds great when you only own an acre, but even that doesn't sound that great, right? But like, sounds a whole lot better than when you own, 80, 100, 300 acres and have this problem. Right, like that's really where you start being like, okay, all right.
Yeah.
I'm going to do the $500 an acre treatment, not the $2,000 an acre treatment. I'm going to do it once. It's going to be effective for 5 years, right? And then we'll figure out how we can use that later rather than like, oh, I'm going to do 2,000 this year and it's going to be 1,500 forever. So,
All right. Well, thank you very much. We have to wrap up. Thanks, Jason, so much for the presentation. And a reminder for folks, next month we have Susan Herndon from Sonoma Water to talk about the new fire resilience planner that they've got, that they're going to, give us a sneak preview of something they're developing. And then again, Jason, thanks so much. This is very, very worthwhile. And yeah, you guys, everybody have a great President's Day weekend. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks so much for coming out, and we'll see you again.
thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jason.